woman who's just died within the last year, a woman by the name of Mabel Hampton, a black woman who was also an entertainer in Harlem in the 1920s and 30s. And Mabel told me that Gladys was actually bisexual, but felt that it wouldn't be good for business if she let the heterosexual part of her life be known. She thought that this lesbian image was just so outrageous, so outrageous and wild that it helped to draw people to her as an entertainer. I'm certain that Mabel was right, not only because she knew Gladys Bentley well, but also because of an article that I found in 1952 in Ebony magazine. It was really a sort of a sad article. I'm not sure how much of it to believe, but apparently Gladys Bentley decided in the 50s to practice the other side of her bisexuality, and she became heterosexual. The article that I discovered in Ebony magazine had the title, "I Am a Woman Again," and the subtitle was, "Fabulous Entertainer Tells How She Found Happiness in Love After Medical Treatment to Correct Her Strange Affliction." It talks about this hormone treatments that she had been taking that not only enlarged her infantile uterus, but made it possible for her to stop being interested in women and to marry heterosexually, not only once but twice. She must have gotten a lot of hormones. She promises in that article that she's going to write a book on her experiences. Fortunately, she never wrote that book, but she said that book would help others who are, quote, trapped in a modern-day well of loneliness. And she said that she believes that writing such a book would help her feel free and give me some redemption from my sins. The article is just replete with these very sad pictures of this once fantastic woman now in a house dress, doing things like bending over a stove, cooking and making beds, doing dishes, and the caption on those pictures say things like, "Miss Bentley prepares to make homecoming hubby comfortable." I guess it's really significant because it shows how far the 1950s traveled from the 1920s, how far from those images of the BD woman, the narrator who talks about, "I want the whole world to know it's true I wear a collar and a tie, like to watch while the women pass by." It's certainly a distance of light years. Well, it's really hard to know, I think, how many of those women that I've been talking about who came to Harlem, particularly to be lesbian, were really committed to lesbianism as a way of life. But I discovered some other interesting information. There was one book that was published in 1929 by a sociologist by the name of Catherine Beaumont Davis. The book is called "Factors in the Sex Lives of 2,200 Women." And she discovered her questionnaire was not aimed at lesbians specifically at all, but she just sent the same questionnaire out to 2,200 women. And it had a few questions about emotional relations with other women. One said, for example, "Have you ever experienced intense emotional relations with other women as an adult?" 50.4% of the women who responded said that they had. And then there was another question about whether those relations were either sexual or recognized as sexual in character. And about 25% of those women, who were sort of randomly selected, said that their relations were either sexual or recognized as sexual in character. She unfortunately doesn't say how many of those respondents actually chose to commit themselves to lesbianism as a way of life. But I think it's clear that many women were having lesbian sexual experiences in the I imagine that many of those, if they had the Kinsey scale available to them, would have ranked themselves as something like a 2 or 3 on the Kinsey scale and wouldn't have called themselves lesbians. But while the number of women who were committed to lesbianism was probably not very large in the 1920s, I think it's clear that a lot of women did experiment with it for a number of reasons. And I want to suggest some of those reasons now. I think that one reason that so many women felt free to experiment with lesbianism at that time is that they often regarded it as being not different from romantic friendship in the 19th century. It simply took on another dimension, a sexual dimension. But they wouldn't have called it, even though it was sexual, they wouldn't have called it lesbian. I think some women felt free to experiment with lesbianism because it was for them a kind of maybe a brief sloughing off of restrictions on women's sexuality. And I think that they felt that those restrictions were representative of restrictions on women's freedom in general, and so it was one more area in which they would challenge restrictions. I think that some women felt free to experiment with lesbianism in the 1920s because for them it was a kind of acting out of repressed impulses such as Freud and psychoanalysis, which was so popular at that time, seemed to give them permission to do. And I think that many women were really encouraged by the public fascination with lesbianism. It really stopped being a love that dared not speak its name and began to be, at least for a short period of time, a relationship that women who were adventurous could feel free to deal in. I think many of those women who had homosexual experiences later married. Many of them may have felt much less obliged to make a choice between homosexuality and heterosexuality as women have in eras that we're more familiar with, certainly in the 1970s. With the pressure of lesbian feminism, women felt that bisexuality was not an option, that they had to choose to be lesbian or to lead lesbian feminism. And then I think that many women simply had to be at least partly heterosexual in the 1920s for a number of reasons. Financial, of course. Many women were not self-supporting. If they wanted children in the 1920s, they didn't have the option of artificial insemination. They would have to get married. I think women in the 1920s still felt in more conventional areas a lot of social pressure, much more than we can imagine today. But in any case, it's clear that by the 1920s, in some circles, to have a lesbian experience no longer meant, as it had at the beginning of the century and in the late 19th century, when the sexologists first came to define lesbianism, it meant then